the Drummer Mindset Podcast. I'm Joel Pereira. Today I released my episode with Jeff Hankin. Jeff started playing the drums at the age of 8. In the past 6 decades as a musician, he's performed with jazz, rock, blues, symphonic, chamber, and musical theater groups in small clubs to large concert halls. He's taught drums and music at elementary to college level, public, private, and commercial music schools. He earned his music degree at University of Chicago and was a graduate teaching fellow at Brandeis University. He also studied at the San Francisco Conservatory, the Louisville School of Music, and the Cincinnati College Conservatory. In 2008, he founded Carolina Drumworks. Through this conversation, you'll hear just how excited and how enthusiastic he is about the art of making drums and how he engages with each drum. And you'll learn about the difference between a boutique drum maker and a custom drum maker. You'll also learn not just about, how to look for these kinds of drums or build these drums or have a customized project done, but also how to find the drums, on the used market, the new market or whatever. Is very helpful, and also how to relay the sounds that you're hearing and to understand what the audience is hearing and how that differs. I was honored to have him here, and so without further ado, it's me and Jeff Hankin. And so if I remember correctly, you started Carolina Drumworks in 2008?
It's been, actually this fall is 15 years.
15 years.
So
congratulations.
I don't know what date, so.
Uh-huh. And had you built many drums before you started the business?
Enough to sort of have a little bit of consistency to it.
Mm-hmm.
I like to take the approach that every drum's going to be better than the one before, which is, they're all different, so it's hard to say, but there's a developmental thing. I think what I was doing at that stage was good, and I could be confident in it. I've done a lot of modifications of what I'm doing since then. So
yeah, I'm sure. How long have you been playing drums?
That gets into the age thing.
Or what age did you start playing?
I started when I was 8.
8, okay.
And coming up on 74. So,
okay.
It's been a long time.
Yeah.
As I tell my students.
Yeah. And how did the drums find you, or did you find them?
Well, I'm one of those kids. My mother used to tell me the story of how I was banging on her pots and pans.
Sure.
So she got some old pots and pans and put them in a low cabinet that I could reach. I don't remember that.
Okay.
So, but I always wanted to play drums. The school in those days had music programs in elementary school, and in 3rd grade you were allowed to start an instrument. And I was thinking drums, and then at the last minute I decided I wanted to play the trumpet.
Okay.
So they what they did is they got you into this room with a bunch of instruments, and they said, let's try things out. And they gave me a trumpet and said, okay, so blow. And I had no idea how you make a sound with a trumpet, so I blew.
Sure.
And nothing happened.
they didn't teach you anything about embouchure or anything.
Right,
they just handed it to you.
Right. And they said, well, maybe clarinet.
Okay.
And my sister's orthodontist said, no, you're not going to clarinet because you have enough of an overbite now.
Okay.
So my second choice was drums.
Okay.
And got into that, and then a year later I started trumpet, which only lasted about 5 years. But drums I stayed with.
Yeah, and they've been pretty consistent throughout your life.
Pretty consistent. There was a low period of not playing very much for some years, just due to life changes, and then got back into it. I started out. It's hard to say, 8 years old, you're going to start with classical music, but I sort of steered in that direction first. And probably when I was around 12 or so, I got really heavily into timpani. And that was my love. But then I decided, I want to compose. I want to write music.
Okay.
I don't want to be interpreting music.
college as a in high school I was turned into a kind of a conservatory brat,
as we moved around, and I studied with some really fine timpanists from major orchestras, and we went from Bethesda, Maryland. We went to Louisville, Kentucky, to San Francisco. Then I went to college in Chicago,
Okay.
and so different teachers in these areas. And then I decided I wanted to write, and went to college as a music major,
Mm-hmm.
and found myself, what are you going to do for a living? So I fell into photography and then advertising, marketing,
Okay.
communications, but I kept the music going. And I started playing jazz in high school. I started when I got to Chicago, of course, blues,
Mm-hmm.
and then I have played with classic rock bands, which I would not do again.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and
Why is that?
so it's I'm not someone who likes to do things just like the recording, and that's what people expect in music that has been popular.
More okay, so more like a
Um,
lot of covers.
a lot of covers,
Mm-hmm.
and I've played with guitar players who, like, if you're not doing the same fill that's on the record,
Right.
it confuses them.
Uh-huh.
Uh, and I like dynamics, which is sort of counter to what the recording industry is doing,
Right.
for the sake of compressing everything into even levels. But then I was playing with a Southern rock band, some various kinds of blues bands, done musical theater stuff, done concert band stuff, done symphonic, a little bit of everything.
Yeah.
Um, and just fun to play.
Yeah.
So, as many musicians know, with a day job, I was free to do music that I enjoyed,
Yeah.
rather than I was speaking with a career drummer a while ago who was kind of feeling really good about the fact that his wife had just gone to work full time,
Uh-huh.
which freed him up to not take the gigs that he wasn't enthusiastic about,
Yeah.
or wouldn't enjoy playing, that he just was doing because he needed the income.
Right.
So it's a
Gotcha.
little bit of a luxury.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So you've been playing for pretty much all your life.
Hmm.
And then in around '08, or 15 years ago or so now, you decided to start this as a business,
Right.
Carolina Drumworks.
Right.
And and so you had already, from what I understand, you had already had like an aesthetic visually with your photography,
Hmm.
understanding marketing and all those kinds of things that can definitely help in your business. But also just in production. Had you been a hobbyist woodworker before?
I not at the same level.
Right.
It was more in terms of like home do-it-yourself
Sure.
projects. What drove me to make it a business, I'm not what I would call a real entrepreneur, but I've had a couple of small business ventures. Somebody gave me a copy of Mickey Hart's book,
Oh, right.
Drumming on the Edge of Magic.
Uh-huh.
And in the book, and he's talking mostly about hand percussion,
Sure.
and world percussion. But he says, 2/3 of the way through the book, that he felt every drummer should have the experience of building himself a drum and playing it, and
Sure.
as a spiritual experience,
Yeah.
of really getting into the relationship to the drum and the heart of the sound, and I thought, well, that's a good idea, but I don't do much hand percussion.
Right.
So I went on eBay and I put a bid in on a Babinga stave shell,
Okay.
steam band. I don't even remember.
Uh-huh.
But and nobody else bid on it, so I won,
Okay.
much to my surprise.
Uh-huh.
And then I had to build it out. So like, how do you do this?
Uh-huh.
And I got into there was a wonderful forum, which, like many forums, was killed off by Facebook.
Uh-huh.
Forum called Ghost Note,
Okay.
and it was a group of guys who were builders, independent builders. Some of whom were doing it as a sort of a sideline project, and some of whom were doing it for the sake of exploration and innovation and problem solving, and how do you
Mhm.
do this, and what's the theory behind it. And it was the least moderated forum I have ever seen, which means anybody could say anything they
Right.
wanted to. And so nobody got away with any theory or approach or methodology without being taken to the wall by other people.
Right. Right.
And it was a little bit rough,
Sure.
but there was a lot of knowledge there
Uh-huh.
and a lot of experiences, some of which didn't work in the process. So I picked up a lot of information there and kind of got into the core group.
You bring up this point that I've been thinking a lot about just in general, and I've talked a little bit about with other people as far as, when you're gaining information or if someone provides you any kind of criticism. And I think one thing that seems to be lost is that when people, if someone comes off gruff or they're just outright offensive to you, people almost completely shut down and nothing else can be heard. And I understand where that comes from. I mean, it's not appropriate for someone to just be offensive when they're trying, that's not really forgivable. And at the same time, there's something that can be sifted through.
Yeah, always. I used to figure in, going to a lot of various kinds of seminars and conferences, and you sit through 2 hours of presentation of some sort. And even if you're already really familiar with it, and you may be more familiar with it than the person who's presenting it, there's going to be 5 or 10 minutes of really valuable stuff in there.
Right.
And just on the topic of forums, I was looking at something recently, and I can't remember where it was or what the main thing was, but it was something about somebody who was playing and sort of was told by a more experienced player, you're doing it wrong, or you're not up to this level that we need, and took it as well, this guy was just incredibly rude and unhelpful.
Right.
And I actually responded to that one, and I said, I have learned a ton of information from people who were complete jerks.
Right.
And don't judge the information.
Right.
Even if the person's going to rub you the wrong way and you never want to see them or talk to them again.
Right.
So I've had teachers that were not good teachers, but if you could draw the information out of them, there's a lot to learn.
Right.
There. So
that was one of the lessons I got early on from my dad. Like he had worked in he was like an administrator in a college, and when I was going through his studies, and I was getting frustrated by this teacher or that teacher, he said that piece of paper that you're working toward is really more evidence to other people that you know how to navigate a bureaucracy more than exactly what you've learned. And he said that sometimes you have to learn just in spite of or despite the teachers that you have. And every institution goes through turnover, and like it may be some of the best schools on paper, and they still have turnover and they go through rough spots, and it's not always going to be what you expect.
A professor in college, and I'm not sure I even took a course with him, but he said to me, you don't go to college to learn.
Right.
You go to college to learn how to learn.
Yeah.
And that's one of those half a dozen pithy
right.
statements that I've sort of held on to, and it applies everywhere. And if you can figure out how to do your own research and do your own information and do your own sifting and evaluation and comparison of information, that's how you learn. It's not somebody at a blackboard who's going to just outline everything for you.
Right.
And that's I think making drums got me more geared toward woodworking than the other way around, is the answer to your question a while ago.
Yeah.
Because since then I've like taken up little furniture projects and things. But I was more in the carpentry side, I think, rather than the woodworking side.
And so it was really this forum that kind of where you got a lot of your education and other study, I would assume. Was there ever a master apprentice situation? Did you have any folks to call on?
No. It's mostly it's a learn by doing trade, and you can also take apart drums that other people have done and learn a lot from that and start to figure out, why did he do it this way?
Sure.
I would say most of the methods that I use, my preferences in bearing edge profiles, for example, and how that works on several drums together or different sides of the same drum, have been from gathering the information about how these individual components function and then applying some logic
Right.
about goals and how to get to what you want in terms of the sound, the character of the drum. Goes back to that learning how to learn.
Sure.
When I studied drums with all these various teachers, there were a lot of them whose initial approach was to take apart everything you had done before, and here's the new method.
Okay.
Which I never was very fond of because it just makes things really confusing and non-functional for a while. But building up those experiences, you have a portfolio of reasoning for how you approach something.
Sure.
That you can take a little of this and a little of that and come up with something that's got some really sound basis. I like to think better results.
Yeah.
Better outcomes.
So you first started with or at least your first project was this shell. Do you still get kind of these shells? Do you start with shells or do you start with planks of wood?
It depends. My goal, my philosophy has to do with turning out the best end result that I can. There are some people who are better at some of those processes than I am, and I'd rather have those people do that.
Sure.
So I do partnering with them for those things. I can design my hardware, my lugs. I'm not a machinist.
Sure.
So I'd rather turn it over to somebody that really knows what they're doing in that field. So some of the shells I do from the boards. Sometimes I'll pick out a board and have somebody else work on it. Sometimes they'll have better access to the wood sourcing in case of a certain species.
Yeah.
So
is there a species of wood that you find is just the most joy, like you find the most joy to work with, but then just does not produce the best material?
Well, I don't work much with woods that are not tone woods.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe for furniture, but not for drums. So that narrows it down.
In the tone woods, maybe we would talk about. I know there's got to be a lot, but maybe we keep it down to maybe the 5 or so. Like,
well, maple, which is, I do some ply drums. I don't do a lot of them just because I don't get that many requests, and you can get ply drums anywhere. So, but maple is a good sort of middle of the road, dependable standard starting place. And I love some of the rosewood family and the babingas, stuff that's getting hard to get now and hard to ship. I do a lot of walnut as a kind of an all-around sound. It's a little beefier than the maple. Cherry I work in. I don't get as much interest in it. But to get back to your question, some of the woods that produce just beautiful tones may be really irritating, and I mean that in different senses of the word.
Right.
To work
because like
with.
walnut can be, kind of toxic, right? To a degree.
Walnut. I sometimes I was working in Morado, which is also called Bolivian rosewood. It's not a true rosewood, but it has a lot of the characters. And since rosewood is so hard to get now, it's being used. They use it a lot. Actually, it's taking the place of rosewood on a lot of guitar fretboards.
Okay.
At this point, as Pau Ferro, it's also under that name. But working with it in hot temperatures can produce a very fine dust that, if there's any perspiration on your wrists or arms or whatever as you're working, you can build up a sensitivity to it. And these days, if I'm working with that wood, I almost suit up in hazmat to do it. But Paduk is another one. I don't have a sensitivity problem to it, but it's just it'll coat the whole shop in this fine
Right.
powder. But it's a gorgeous wood for sound.
Mm-hmm.
And once it's completed and you're not sanding or scraping anymore, it's fine.
Yeah.
I've used it in cutting boards,
Sure.
so it's all food safe when it's done. But um, so there are some things that are tough to work with. I haven't run into mahogany. Sometimes can misbehave on like a table saw,
Uh-huh.
and bend in strange ways as you're cutting it. There are some woods that will dull tools
Right.
very quickly, but not. I don't know. Tough to work with
Yeah.
is so subjective.
Sure.
And I also see. I see personalities in all of this. I see personalities in the wood. I see personalities in the finished drum. Personalities in a board
Okay.
and the grain and all this. And some of the stuff that has the most interesting appearance may be more difficult to work with.
Mm-hmm.
For example, a highly figured board
Mm-hmm.
is much more difficult to bend.
Mm-hmm.
It's more difficult to smooth.
Sure. And when you say figured, you're talking about the imperfections. Maybe there's knots in it or these kinds of things.
Well, that and even where it's not a knot type of situation, if the grain changes direction,
Uh-huh.
that complicates things a lot.
Right. Because I would imagine if there's any knots in it, it's probably not used.
I've done them with knots,
Okay.
and it can be interesting, but it's riskier.
Yeah.
And sometimes just in pure economic terms, sometimes the
Sure.
risk is not worth taking. Bending wood, there are always chances of it cracking
Mm-hmm.
during the process and or tearing out. And so you have to be real careful. Things go really slowly. And with something like a quilted maple,
Yeah.
for example, where the grain is, the direction of the grain is changing directions a lot, and that's what makes that figuring.
Uh-huh.
So sometimes you're working with face grain, sometimes it turns into end grain, and sometimes it turns back into face grain. This type of stuff, it can be risky
Right.
to bend, and it's not cheap. So if it takes you 3-4 tries, you've gone through a lot of money, and sometimes more than the drum would be priced
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
when finished. So, there are certain woods that I would recommend doing something like a stave construction,
Right.
because you're not trying to play with the fibers
Right.
of the wood. And there are some woods where I will use sanders rather than planers, because I'm not putting a blade across that varying grain,
Sure.
or I have to turn it at an angle
Mhm.
to feed it through the blade.
Yeah.
And
Well-
these are things that customers don't care about. So.
Right, right. It's fascinating to me, but yeah, well, I want to kind of get back to as well, like that decision to kind of start making drums. And one of the things that became more obvious to me after I started practicing psychiatry, I was talking to a consulting physician. We were just talking
Mhm.
about different profiles of people that we might run into, and it almost seemed like there was this, and these are gross generalizations, right? So this means nothing about any specific individual, but it seems like there was enough of a profile that would come up that we just found interesting. A lot of times doctors' kids end up trying drugs probably pretty early.
Mhm.
Lawyers' kids end up in jail or in legal trouble, these kinds of things. And kind of came down to like an old saying, but the cobbler's kids have no shoes. And so I'm just kind of curious for you, like at the point that you started making drums,
Mhm.
what was your playing career or endeavor? How has that changed since you started making drums versus playing? Or, I mean, what is your playing like?
Well,
these
I've
days?
discovered, first of all, I've discovered satisfaction in listening to somebody play a drum that I've made.
Oh, yeah.
And that's equally as much fun for me
Yeah.
as playing. and you don't have to carry anything.
I like it.
Right?
Yeah. Oh,
You
that's
don't have to set
fascinating.
up. You know, it's
The work is being done at some point, though.
yeah,
Right. Like you're
right. It's just
creating
not
it.
me.
Right.
But so that's fun, and it reminds me of when I was a composition student
Uh-huh.
and listening to a performance of something that I had written. It's a little nerve-wracking,
Mm-hmm.
and at the same time, it's just joyful.
Yeah.
You know,
A little nerve-wracking.
well, in that case, it's something that you've heard in your head for months,
Right.
and how does it sound to
Mm-hmm.
somebody else? I
Right.
guess is the bottom line there.
Sure.
In what I've made in the last 15 years, I think there was one time that I couldn't make a customer happy.
Okay.
And that was a guy who was just all about metal drums, and he was trying to find a sound in a wood shell.
Okay.
And none of them were metal.
Uh-huh.
So he just couldn't get there. We were trying all kinds of things, and this drum actually was not what I would have intended to build. I get nervous every time I ship a drum.
Sure.
You know, I do a little road test
Uh-huh.
on things, and sometimes I'm not completely satisfied. I might recut the edges,
Okay.
change my mind about what's going to get me to where I think it needs to be. It's a little bit like when I'm doing finishes, and I do all hand applied finishes. I have no spray equipment,
Uh-huh.
and because that visit with the shell every day
Right.
and hands on literally experience is part of what I like about doing it. Sometimes I will get through 15, 20 applications of finish and decide I really don't have the foundation of the finish the way I want it, and
Oh,
I'll
wow.
strip it off and start the whole thing over.
Uh-huh.
And I'll contact the customer and say, I'm sorry, this is taking so long, and I've never gotten any response besides, no problem, take your time, do it the way you think it should be,
Okay.
which is great. And so other than this one guy who was trying to make a wood drum into a metal drum,
Right.
I've always had that nervous thing when I ship a drum. Are they going to like it?
Uh-huh.
Knock on wood. It's always come back. This I love this drum. I can't take it off the stand.
Nice.
Some of that I think is that sometimes all it takes is having a drum that feels good to play. That sort of inspires.
Right.
And that matters in many cases a lot more than the specific sound.
Yeah, right. It's one of the things that I've been seeing pop up so many times. I just read Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Process. There's tons of books out there on the creative process, and one of the consistent things that I've been hearing from those books, and then also from this podcast, and folks that have been doing these kinds of things for such a long time, is not having a planned outcome is so key for the creative process. Because when you begin a creative process, you never really know where it takes you, but you have to consistently rely on your taste, and you never know when it's going to be done. And it might not ever be done. And some people say a piece of art is never done; it's just abandoned. Right?
It's a study in dissatisfaction.
Uh-huh.
One of my composition teachers told me I finished sort of my first sizable composition, and he said, "Now, stop writing that. Don't do it anymore. Go on to something else."
What's
because
next?
otherwise you'll be rewriting this thing and editing and refining for the rest of your life, and you'll never write anything else. He also told me that he could teach self-editing, but he could not teach creativity. You can't teach somebody to be creative.
Right.
And a lot of creativity, I think, is self-editing. It's being your own critic.
Yeah.
And listening to that and responding to that, and keep refining and refining and refining as you go.
So what would you say to the folks that might be considering a custom drum, whether it's from you or anyone else? What are those kind of pieces of information, those questions that folks don't ask that they should be asking, or that you feel like they should be asking or looking for?
I think there are people who come to me saying, I like what you're doing. Do something for me.
Yeah.
And there are people who come to me and say, well, it says custom drum. So, and I kind of don't use that term too much for myself,
Right.
because to me, a custom drum is you pick from column A and you pick from column B and you pick from column C and say, these are the components in the design that I want. And it may not be good choices.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also limiting to those things. So I do drums in the style that I do.
Uh-huh.
I don't, for example, I don't wrap a drum. I've never wrapped a drum.
Uh-huh.
I won't work with somebody else's lugs.
Okay.
I
So wherever you source your lugs, like whatever that's kind of that's what you keep stock.
That's my design. It's done the way it's done for reasons
Mm-hmm.
that have to do with end result.
Uh-huh.
And if I use something else, it's going to not contribute to that end result and sometimes negate some other factor.
What do you think other lugs, like maybe bullet lugs, do to the drum as opposed to the tube lugs that you use?
It's tube lugs are more precise.
Mm-hmm.
They generally have a smaller footprint.
Mm-hmm.
They're, in the case of the ones that I use, they're made of better materials that have relationship to various resonance
Mm-hmm.
qualities. I use stainless steel tubes,
Mm-hmm.
partly polished stainless. I used to use chrome-plated aluminum,
Mm-hmm.
but the plating
Doesn't like aluminum, does it?
is well, it doesn't like aluminum, and it's also one more layer of variable.
Uh-huh.
And if we get the stainless polished to a certain level, it's very close in appearance.
Right.
But it's a much harder metal and has better tonal qualities, resonance qualities than aluminum, and also it'll make the threads very precise and very durable in there. And the posts are solid brass, which is a wonderful resonant metal.
Mm-hmm.
And when you compare that with a die-cast lug, which is usually zinc on the inside, they're really in two different worlds.
Yeah.
Of transmitting vibration.
Okay.
So there's a little less effect on, when you put one lug on a drum,
Mm-hmm.
and it changes the sound of the shell
Sure.
right off the bat. So when you're adding mass, that changes the fundamental pitch,
Sure.
even if it's not affecting resonance qualities.
Mm-hmm.
So it has a lot of effect
Mm-hmm.
on the drum sonically, and the tube lug has two advantages. One is the footprint is very small, and it's in areas that won't interfere with the vibration
Okay.
in the shell. And the second is that in terms of tension, which is particularly an issue with snare drums,
Mm-hmm.
the tension runs parallel to the shell,
Okay.
about half an inch standing out
Uh-huh.
from the shell. So it's not putting any strain whatsoever on the shell.
Okay.
The tube lug also has no insert,
Okay.
and that means that the angle cannot change. The angle of the tension rod
Mm-hmm.
cannot change, which is very demanding. It's very exacting,
Yeah.
but it puts things in exactly the right spot. This can't not only questions of splay outward
Uh-huh.
or inward, but also side to side.
Okay.
And when you start pulling from the side or angled inward or outward,
Uh-huh.
then you, with a single point attachment, you can stress the fibers in the wood,
Sure.
and that changes sound.
Yeah.
And we're talking about fine points here. I
Sure.
mean, nuances, but all these nuances add up.
Right.
And there are so many of them.
Yeah.
It's a little bit like the difference between, a lot of people ask me the difference between a steam bent shell versus a stave shell.
Sure.
In sonic qualities.
Uh-huh.
And a steam bent shell, it is not trying to spring back into into straightness.
Right.
Once it's bent, it's bent.
Right.
But in bending with that, if you just take a piece of wood and bend it without any support,
Mm-hmm.
the outer fibers are going to stretch and
Yeah.
and
then the inside fibers are going to
tear.
compress. Right.
The inside fibers are going to compress.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens during the bending process is you support the outer part of the shell,
Mm-hmm.
and the inside fibers do compress,
Mm-hmm.
and that raises the fundamental pitch.
Okay.
About, not a lot, about a half step.
Mm-hmm.
With the stave construction, nothing happens to the fibers.
Right.
Right, they're fully intact. They're under no stress.
Mm-hmm.
They haven't changed length or density.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, there's a little fuller sound there,
Hmm.
and a little beefier, slightly beefier tone. The other difference, of course, is one is vertical
Right.
grain, and the other is horizontal grain, and there are differences in how the sound vibration can move through the shell.
And I guess when you're talking about the treatment of the wood to begin with, and I don't want to get too in the weeds with all the technical stuff, but I do find it interesting. Right? Yeah. And I think it comes down again too to like all those details that, I mean, it's the same. I think a lot of musicians can get down. I mean, we talk about millimeters when we change the height of your snare drum.
Mm-hmm.
Or exactly where your throne is positioned and the shape of that. So there are details and details.
Yep. Yeah.
But what I'm just curious about real quick is just the stave construction, and I assume that all your raw materials. I mean, the wood itself is going to be pretty completely dry, and then it will be treated. And I'm sure if someone is buying these custom drums, they're taking care of it in a controlled environment. But at the same time, I just wonder about expansion of these staves versus, a bent shell.
Different, and this will lead us to a discussion of solid wood versus ply. But the different species have different expansion contraction rates. Let's say, and they talk about it in terms of percentages, and it's in certain directions relative to the grain. Right. It usually expands perpendicular to the grain direction, so a stave drum, if it expanded, would expand in circumference. Right. And diameter, which would affect how the head fit. Sure. Right. A steam bent drum would expand vertically, right? Because the grain's running sideways, which would not affect. It could affect the tuning, the little. What do we got? 1.25 inches, right? Between or maybe between the lug post and the rim, right?
But I guess there's also that distance too. Like really, when you talk about it in woodworking, you talk about it over if you're doing tabletops, like these wide expanding surfaces, versus a stave, which is really it's gonna have so many cuts in it.
But it doesn't take much. If you think about how much you turn a tension rod and change the pitch, just in tuning a drum and trying to get everything at the same pitch. A quarter turn can make a lot of difference. Yeah. Right. So anyway, this stave drum, depending on species, might expand by 1 millimeter, 2 millimeters, and that can be significant. However, if it's properly sealed, right, during the finishing process, it's going to behave itself pretty well.
Okay.
You'll have with any solid wood slightly more sensitive to weather changes. If you go you're traveling to a gig in August and you're going to be an hour and a half in the car,
Right.
and you don't have any air conditioning. It's an old car,
Right.
And you get to the club and the club has the air conditioning
Yeah.
roaring, and you're going to want a little time for that drum to acclimate,
Yeah.
and you're going to want to check the tuning.
Yeah.
Before you play.
It just reminded me. There's do you know Evan Martin?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. He's a car guy too,
Oh.
and so he likes to sometimes take his drums to a gig in his little Miata with the top down.
Done that. Yeah.
So it just makes me think about, just that exposure, but also if it's got to feel pretty good to arrive
Well,
at your gig.
it gets in there. I mean, I get
in your
customers in
convertible.
Maine and Montana and Hawaii and Phoenix, and they're saying, I'm in a different climate here.
Right.
And again, if the drum is sealed, it's not much of a problem.
Sure.
That's one reason that I seal and finish edges.
Yeah.
A lot of companies don't.
That's right. Okay.
But I just want that thing fully.
Yeah. This company
Closed
does
off.
not. It doesn't seem. It could be some kind of wax coating.
But that's plywood.
That's true.
Okay. So plywood, there are advantages and disadvantages.
Sure.
It's can be much stronger on a very thin shell.
Mm-hmm.
It holds its shape
Right.
on a very thin shell. And the grain is layered at alternating directions.
Right.
So you have usually the outer ply
very
will be
stable.
horizontal, and then the next one will be vertical, next one
Mhm.
horizontal, next vertical, next horizontal inside
Mm-hmm.
for appearance. So it doesn't fluctuate much.
Yeah.
But what happens is now you're talking about trying to get the vibration through the shell,
Mm-hmm.
and there are many pieces of wood there that are not, the grain is not continuous.
Yeah.
And worse yet, it keeps changing direction. So this is like, go to Home Depot, go to Lowe's, pick up a piece of pine board
Good
and
luck.
tap on it.
Okay. I thought you were
And
going to
then-
say check the
And then
check the grain.
pick up a piece of plywood and tap on it.
Sure.
And you're going to hear no tone,
Right.
no clear tone pitch out of the plywood.
Right.
But even if it's lousy sonically, it's not a tone wood, but you'll be able to hear a pitch
Right.
out of the solid wood. So plywood is more it's less expensive. You don't have to have great looking wood
Mm-hmm.
for all those layers of veneer, just the outer ones,
Right.
which makes it easier to get.
Right.
It won't expand and contract
Right.
with weather changes. It can if I'm looking for something to gig and where it's going to be knocked around, and I just want to set it up, play. Doesn't matter whether it's a fancy location or a roadhouse, plywood.
Yeah.
But it's not going to have the tonality, and maybe in some cases you don't care about the tonality,
Right.
depending on the music and the venue and the circumstances. Maybe you just want it loud.
Mm-hmm.
That'll work too. So there is certainly some argument for plywood
Mm-hmm.
shells, but in my building, I'm going for tone.
Right.
And character. So I like
Yeah.
working with the solid woods.
Yeah. Before we hit record, I was kind of doing a bit of a rabbit hole kind of dive into the neurology of sound
Mhm.
and how it can vary between individuals so much, and sound hits us all a little bit differently. It just depends on what's in your ear. I mean, we could be talking about just wax buildup versus your genetics and how the coils on the inside of your ear in the structures there vary.
Mm-hmm.
The size of your auricle or the pinna, the actual ear, the outer ear that we all see varies. the size of that, the shape of that, all of these things kind of go in. And then your experiences on what you've heard, your taste, all these kinds of things. And we often, what else I've been kind of exploring lately too, aside from that, is just an individual, like a drummer's sound, their characteristics, and there's so much that goes into it. The drums that you have, sometimes it just comes down to the limitations, like what's available, and the tunings and the room and all these kinds of things. How much and what aspects of your process contribute to that, or, make the biggest impact in what people are trying to find or what resonates with them?
One of the problems in describing what you're hearing in your head,
right?
And there are a multitude of problems with, but
what's going on in my head for sure. Yeah.
One of the problems is that we don't have any vocabulary for how to describe that.
Right.
So I'll get people that will say, "I want a drum that goes thwap."
Right.
Right. I want a fat thwap sound.
Or even what the advertisers
and I'll say,
decide to go
"You mean
with.
like a New Orleans feel?"
Uh-huh.
And they'll say, and usually they'll cite a recording.
Sure.
A video, a recording.
Right.
Okay, so that's got all kinds of problems because that doesn't sound anything like the original drum
Elvin
itself.
Jones on Coltrane's Birdland. Right.
How is it tuned?
Right.
How is the miking done? What kind of mic?
And that is such a big part of it.
What was the processing, if any, that went into it?
Right.
What was, how are you receiving that? What kind of file did it get put into?
Right.
What are you listening on?
Right.
Is it coming through studio monitors?
Is it coming through headphones?
Is it coming through your telephone?
Right. And you can have all these questions, and it still probably wouldn't take you to the right conclusion.
Right. And sometimes it's hard to tell people and convince them that what you heard on that recording is not what that drum sounded like.
Right. It's not what Elvin heard when he hit it.
Right. Let's talk about hearing live. So when you're playing drums, you are sitting right over them, and nothing is going to get closer to that drum than a mic that's 2 inches away from the head, which it shouldn't be. But what you're hearing is not what the audience is hearing, even in an unmiked situation. So the sound of your kit from 5 feet in front of it is very different from what you're hearing sitting over it. And what an experienced drummer will be able to do is sort of modify, so he's not necessarily doing this for what he wants it to sound like as much as what he knows it will sound like out front.
Yeah.
And then tune accordingly to that. It's a little bit like if I'm playing with a band and I don't have, a good monitor situation or something, I try to play a little bit louder, just a little bit louder than what I think is appropriate in the mix for what I'm hearing. And that should put me at a reasonably good level within the mix. Because I'm sitting,
and when
I'm sitting, a foot and a half above that snare drum.
Okay.
I'm not hearing the bottom head either, as much as the audience is.
Right.
Just about any drummer will be able to recognize the fact that what they're hearing from the kick drum is not what the kick drum sounds like out the front. I mean, really, night and day difference.
Right. I played last night at the Open Funk Jam at One Stop last night, and that was the first time. I think my drums have been mic'd and used as like a sub maybe once before that I can think of, a long time ago. But this sub was more powerful than any other time. I was definitely having a difficult time trying to consider how I touch this bass drum.
Yeah.
And so I ended up going pretty simple and straightforward because I wasn't quite sure.
That's kind of a things change over time, and what was custom in this decade is different from what was custom in that decade, and now because it's something that I'm not fond of. But a lot of sound engineers will give all the low end to the kick drum
Yeah.
and put the bass in the mids.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and yes, you can distinguish that way the bass guitar from the kick drum.
Right.
But what it does is it separates the kick drum sonically from the rest of the kit.
Right.
Unlike sort of the jazz approach where the kick drum is just another
Yeah.
drum in the group and they should all sound similar quality, right? Just different pitches. So that's kind of something that you were at the mercy of
Yes.
with that. But I'm also thinking about the very deep bass drums
Yeah.
that fortunately are starting to go a little bit out of fashion, but some of the major manufacturers haven't converted yet.
Right.
And what happens with those is they sound great to the drummer,
Right.
and they sound like cardboard out at the front end. And they're just not resonant, and you want some fullness
Yeah.
to a bass drum. So everybody's hearing is different. I mean, that's the basic starter for the whole discussion.
Absolutely.
And I get further by talking to clients in terms of sound quality,
Okay.
and type of music application and their playing style.
Right.
And
Quality is an interesting, it's again like the words you had mentioned before. They're so hard to come by, and even and I guess who's making up the terms are really advertisers and maybe some musicians and things like that. We talk about dry sounds, wet sounds. Are there any terms that you feel like are most helpful when we talk about
I
this
think in
quality?
terms of the character of the drum.
Okay.
To me, the personality of the drum, because they're all different. But responsive, lively, deep, beefy is a word that I used before. It used to be the buzzword was cutting through the mix,
Right.
for snare drums,
In the 90s.
in the 90s.
Uh-huh.
Not so much anymore, thank goodness. But what I try to do is draw out as many descriptions and words as possible, and then do the same thing. I'm put them together with some logic about what all this means,
Right.
and try to arrive at it. A lot of it is subjective in terms of it doesn't matter what the sound is; it matters how the drum feels.
What does that mean?
I'm gonna use a car.
Okay.
Simile. I worked for a guy once who was a sports car nut,
Uh-huh.
and he liked muscle cars, and I was a Roadster fan with a very limited budget, so I couldn't get into his league on it. And one day he went out and he bought a Toyota Supra. This was in the mid '90s. He said, "You got to drive one of these," and I said, "That's kind of out of my league, I would be intimidated." And he said, "Just go to the dealership and sit in one. Just sit in the seat." So I went to a dealership and I said to the salesperson, I said, my boss said I should sit in one of these. And he said, "Go ahead." And I sat in it. It seemed pretty comfy, pretty easy to sit in. And he said, "You want to drive it?" And I said, "Is it going to scare me?" And he said, "Yeah." Take it out.
Sold,
So I took it out on the road, and what I discovered was, with this car, I just had to think, I want to be there. And I was.
Yeah.
And I didn't have to. It was effortless.
Okay.
It was like from brain to tires, without much interference along the way. And a fine musical instrument is easy to play.
Right.
It's comfortable. It doesn't take adjustment. It responds. It like you feel like it's bonding with you, and you can achieve that in drums. And so that feeling of we're kicking it up a level. It's not going to make me a better player, but it's going to bring out the best. It's going to make me sound my best.
Yeah.
And feel my best. And it's inspiring, and you will be motivated, and you will play better because of the feel of the instrument.
Right.
Any kind of instrument. And so that can cover a lot of needs that people don't, if they haven't had an instrument at that level, they don't know this until they sit down and play one.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Because you can't, you kind of can't imagine it without trying it.
Right.
Like sitting in the Toyota.
Mm-hmm.
So there's always that subjective part, which is it's almost a like, oh, I don't know if this is the exact sound that I had in mind, but I don't remember the exact sound I had in mind anymore. I'm so comfortable here,
Right.
you know. So that's a big factor.
Yeah.
One reason that I make kits occasionally, but I sort of focus on snare drums
Mm-hmm.
because people can have a lot of snare drums.
Right.
And
It's the central piece, right?
it's a
I mean,
central
it's in
piece.
between your legs.
It kind of defines your sound.
Yeah.
And snare drums and cymbals.
Mm-hmm.
And so you have lots of cymbals and you have lots of snare drums.
Yeah.
And the kit should do what you want, but
Mm-hmm.
it's not so defining.
Right.
So it might be, this drum is a little bolder sounding than I had in mind, or this drum is a little, it likes to be tuned tighter than I usually tune.
Mm-hmm.
But it's good. And maybe I'll change my sound a little bit, or maybe I'll add it to my arsenal.
Right.
Or maybe I was going to use it for this, and I was going to use it for that. And I told you I would tell you the story of the concert drum story.
Yeah.
Okay. So, Jeff Sipe has a walnut steam vent that I did for him.
Uh-huh.
He came to me a while ago and said, I'm looking for a drum that's like just super, super sensitive,
Uh-huh.
that I can use for recording
Okay.
in the studio. And we went through some descriptions and it turned out that there was a drum he had heard that he was thinking the shell was responsible for the sound quality and the sensitivity. And so I did some checking on it, and it was a cable system,
Okay.
rather than a curly wire
Uh-huh.
system on it.
And these are concert snares that you would usually see that set up for.
Right. So I said, I think what you're looking for is this, and we got together, and I showed him a few snares with cable systems and different kinds of cables, and he picked out one, and then he contacted me a few weeks later, and he said, it's interesting, this drum, this thing is so sensitive and so exacting that any tiny error or unevenness shows. So I've been practicing rudiments. I've gone back to practicing rudiments. I'm having a great time with this drum, just playing rudiments.
Uh-huh.
So he repurposed the drum based on not necessarily, I mean, maybe he's using it for sessions stuff, I don't know, but primarily for another thing that wasn't even a goal when he started.
Yeah.
Just because it's good for him and he's having a great time.
Yeah. He wasn't so attached to that outcome of like, this has got to be a recording snare for this specific issue or this specific situation.
Right.
And but it found a place, and he's enjoying practicing again, which serves the music. So if there's like a more of a, maybe I don't know if it's a more generic request, say someone's into soul, blues, they play at home and in small venues. Like, does that give you maybe, what else would you ask before you would start?
It's, then thinking about species first, that tells me that there's a little bit of versatility needed. There's Probably a little lower fundamental, a little fuller sound
Okay.
in there. Um, that it's not a high volume situation.
Mm-hmm.
And I would probably be talking about walnut,
Mm-hmm.
cherry, kind of in there, a little softer than maple, a little harder than mahogany,
Mm-hmm.
someplace in that neighborhood. And then I would probably, my next question would be about tuning, because uh, the bearing edge profiles have a lot to do with tuning range.
Mm-hmm. Say like medium to high.
Medium to high. It's I would use the same edge, but just different position on the shell edge.
Mm-hmm.
If it's something where and high, medium, low also has a lot to do with the amount of ring. So what I would do, I use an outer roundover,
Mm-hmm.
which has an effect on the amount of contact between the shell and the head. But I can vary where the apex
Mm-hmm.
sits on that to vary the amount of ring. If I'm doing a kit,
Mm-hmm.
I'll use a graduated edge profile
Okay.
because on the smaller drums, higher pitch, usually we would like them to ring a little more.
Mm-hmm.
And the lower drums, floor toms, we're usually struggling to keep the ring under control,
Right.
right? So I'll use a much more rounded area on the lower drums,
Okay.
and a pretty sharp edge on the high drums, which means that apex is going to be out near the outer part of the shell.
Uh-huh.
So you can do that with a snare drum. It's little tiny changes, and we're talking about half millimeter
Mm-hmm.
changes, but they can have a big effect.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to the extremes. Now, the extremes, we were talking about the 90s when everybody wanted that crack through the
Right. Like we have no PA
through the mix.
equipment. Or,
Yeah. Okay. So what happened is people were using a double 45 edge,
Uh-huh.
and putting the apex in the middle,
Uh-huh.
and it's a very sharp crack sound.
Yeah.
Problem is, it's got a sweet spot, and it doesn't like to be tuned anywhere else. It doesn't sound good,
Uh-huh.
right? Just this one tuning, and if you're going to get use and versatility out of a drum, you want it to be able to, you can tune it up, you can tune it down,
Right.
and it might have a different personality that way, but if it sounds good in different places,
Mm-hmm.
you get more for your money.
Yeah.
And it gives you choices. And so that roundover will accomplish a much wider tuning range
Yeah.
in there. So you've got more tone
Mm-hmm.
because of more shell contact, and you've got tuning variability. And I'll cut different edges on the top edge of a snare drum versus the bottom edge of a snare drum because those heads have different functions.
Right.
And the function of the snare side head is to vibrate against the wires.
Uh-huh.
That has to do with sensitivity and
Right.
response in there. So I'll put a sharper edge on that, and we're not going to vary the tuning so much,
Mm-hmm.
but we are going to maximize the amount of vibration in that head. You don't want that in the top head
Mm-hmm.
because the thing will be ringing all over the place. You have overtones and harmonics out of control.
Mm-hmm.
So there we're looking for the tone, and if you think about the chain of events in creating the sound, starting in the head is vibrating. It's a membranophone.
Mm-hmm.
It not as simple a set of vibration wave patterns as a string, for example, that's just going to go up and down in a sine wave.
Mm-hmm.
But there are things happening in different areas of the head at the same time, but the vibrations that are created in the shell are driven downward from the head. So, so you want to maximize or control the extent to which those vibrations are coming through the shell.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I should also say parenthetically, we're not really hearing the shell. If we were, there would be a microphone along the side of the drum. We're
And
hearing
some
we're,
folks
we're
do
hearing
that,
we're
right?
hearing the head. Sometimes they do that.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes they'll mic underneath,
Right.
to get more control over the amount of snare
Mm-hmm.
sound. What you're hearing is the waveforms in the shell sound influencing the waveforms going on inside the drum.
Okay.
Which is why an apply shell, if you're mixing species, the inner plies have much more influence on the sound. The outer plies almost nothing.
Okay.
So you can take a maple ply shell and put almost any outer veneer on it. It's not going to change the sound.
Uh-huh.
Wrapping the drum is not a huge change in the sound.
Uh-huh.
In a ply shell. So we were talking earlier a little bit about the discussion of how much of the sound has to do with the species,
Mm-hmm.
and the answer is it's not a make or break difference,
Uh-huh.
right? There are some people who say there's hardwoods and there's softwoods,
Right.
or there's very hard, there's medium, there's softer end of hardwoods, and those. Then it doesn't matter what species.
Mm-hmm.
I do hear differences in the different species,
Mm-hmm.
and sometimes it's the mix of frequencies. It's not necessarily the fundamental pitch, but rosewood, for example, has a lot of high end
Mm-hmm.
in it. Not that the fundamental is necessarily high, but you're not going to get lows
Okay.
out of a very hard wood like that.
Mm-hmm.
Mahogany is at the very soft end of the hardwoods, the tone woods, and you're going to hear a very round, full
Mm-hmm.
sound out of it, but not much attack,
Mm-hmm.
which is something we perceive as volume.
Uh-huh.
Right? It's not necessarily quieter, but you don't have that high-end attack on there, and so it feels to us like it's quieter.
Yeah.
So that's why they talk about the vintage, the old jazz kits, mahogany, poplar,
Right.
gum, those wonderful warm
Mm-hmm.
sounds, but they're for playing in little jazz clubs. Don't take them out and play rock and roll with them.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So the rosewood end of it, the babinga, babinga has a sort of a full spectrum sound, so
Okay.
I'll set that aside for a minute. But the rosewoods are going to have a lot of attack in there. Maybe not as much body in the sound.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's a minor factor, it's still enough to be significant.
Mm-hmm.
I can do one of those little quizzes where you have 6 recordings and 6 kinds of wood, and can you match them up?
Yeah.
I don't expect that my customers can do that, but
Right.
that's my job. That's not their job. I was at a drum show, one of the Chicago drum shows years ago, and I was not doing stave drums at that time, but a friend of mine in Canada was very, very big on doing stave drums, and I was watching him talk to Will Kennedy, and he was trying to explain to Will about the construction and qualities of a stave drum.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this was kind of early in stave drum popularity, but I could see a kind of a blank face on the receiving end of the information because it didn't mean anything to him,
Right.
right? So it's my job to be familiar with those things and to incorporate them. It's not something that, sometimes a customer just wants to know for the sake of knowing more about
Sure.
his instrument, but it's not something he's usually going to ask about
Mm-hmm.
or be concerned with.
So you go to species.
Which gets back to that I would rather recommend a species
Uh-huh.
based on the kind of sound and the kind of work and the kind of playing than have a customer come in and say,
This is what I want.
I'm looking
Right.
for, and I get a lot of people. I had a guy recently desperate for koa,
Uh-huh.
and koa is a nice sounding wood. It's really hard to get
Uh-huh.
right now. It's horrendously expensive,
Yeah.
and to get it in configuration that you can actually make a shell out of is almost impossible.
Mm-hmm.
I was suggesting, well, you can get a similar sound out of acacia, which is a family that koa is a member of,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe Australian blackwood in that family can be really nice. He wanted koa
Okay.
or nothing else, so
Yeah.
it didn't happen.
Yeah. Okay, so clearly I'm shopping a little bit. So if it's like a soul kind of blues, maybe, I mean, funk's a different thing, but classic funk soul perspective, right? Uh, and you consider something like walnut. You consider the bearing edge as well for how much ring you want, and then you have kind of your proprietary, I don't know if they're proprietary, but the your go-to lugs hoop type. What would you go with?
Probably. Well, the thing about ring in a drum is you can take it out, you can't add it.
Right.
So it's better to have something that's got some ring to it,
Okay.
and an relatively open voice. Now that being said, die-cast hoops will focus that a little bit. Triple flange will really open it up. Wood hoops can be, in a way, the best of both worlds.
Okay.
But if you're hitting hard, if you're doing rim shots, the die-cast is going to be like a starter's pistol for those rim shots. Wood hoops have beautiful sounding rim shots. They've got tone, but they're not going to get as much volume. It's not going to be as authoritative in that. And the triple flange is going to be more about the head and less about the hoop sound.
Yeah.
But that's going to sort of maximize the openness. And in triple flange, there are also different thicknesses of hoops. A lot of manufacturers in their lower line will ship 1.6 millimeter hoops, which I will immediately replace with 2.3 millimeter. And for snares now, there are 3 millimeter hoops out, which are, I guess, sonically more like the sort of the S hoops. But I think I would stick with die casts for what you're describing, just to get that little punchiness in there. I think I agree with you. I think you want some ring in the drum. Maybe a little more if you're going to be cranking it up high. But I think walnut is a good choice. It's versatile. It's full. It can be, believe me, it can be tuned up. If you want to tune high, then I would want to protect the amount of ring in the drum. Question of depth. Question of how many wires, how many strands on the snare wires. I like a certain snare bed profile.
Right.
So I don't like to go to the real high number of strands, because that'll get outside the snare bed, won't sit very well in position. Getting back to those multiple factors, so the position of the strainer on the shell, whether it's high or low, can also determine what angle the tension on the snare wires is being pulled at, and that can contribute to how flat it sits against the head. It's all these things mixed together.
Yeah.
So too many wires, number one, won't fit. If you do the Ludwig Tama type of snare bed, it's about a third of the circumference of the snare drum, and it's very, very shallow. It's very slight. So you can put a real wide set of snare. You can do the 42 strand on there if you want. I like to keep that bed between the adjacent lugs, so that you don't have tuning variances in that snare side head. In other words, if the drum is shallower going out from where the wires sit. Or let's say from the strainer position, maybe easier to describe that way. If the drum is shallower, 4 inches away from that, then your tuning is going to be affected.
Right.
And so you have a choice of less tension on those lugs, or you bend the rim a little bit in order to have the same tension. Even tension on a drum head affects the vibration.
Sure.
So you get your clearest tone and the most vibration out of same pitch tuning all the way around. Right. So in order to, and what's the function of the bottom head? The function of the bottom head is to vibrate against the wires. So I like to keep the snare bed cut between those two lugs, adjacent lugs, so that it's not affecting the tuning rods. And that limits the number of wires. So the question is, do you want 16 strands or 20 strands or 12 strands?
Right.
But again, the number of wires will affect how much snare sound you hear. So usually what I tell customers is, in the road testing, let me see what the drum likes.
Yeah.
And that'll kind of make the decision about what's going to work best.
Yeah.
In it.
What you've kind of mentioned a couple of, like, or we've talked about a couple of times, just like the whatever's in fashion, right? Like in the 90s, it was, cutting snare drums that would cut through the mix. What about the snare tom, or snom, as it's like been called?
I've done a couple of them. There are pluses and minuses. It's having a drum do double duty saves another piece of equipment. That's money. That's setup. That's a whole bunch of stuff. But then you get into the question of, so what edges are you going to use? Now, the edge that I cut on the bottom of a snare drum is different from the edge I cut on the bottom of a tom.
Right.
Because now there's different goals for that head. And back to the even tuning question, if you want a tom to hold a note that's nice and clear pitch, then you don't want any unevenness in the bearing edge, right? Any change in depth. So it kind of makes the tom not quite the best it could be. And then it's also not quite the best snare drum. Personally, I would rather put another snare on the other side of the hi-hat pedal.
Yeah. Has there been anything that's come up in these last 15 years that you've been making these drums that for you has held on?
I think the influence of the boutique makers. And we've all seen this at trade shows. When I say we, I mean the boutique makers. Of the big companies coming around and taking a look at what's being done. So you've got big companies producing steam bench shells for the first time in about 50 years. The whole move to tube lugs, I think, was a retro thing, but the independent builders started with that more. Stave drums, yes, absolutely. And I keep seeing that, and a lot of companies. I know there's one boutique builder out in Colorado who was seeing one of the big companies kept coming by anytime he was exhibiting at a show, and then seeing his design ideas turning up in that company. And if people really went after patent enforcement, you'd see a lot of the big companies who have taken patents on stuff that they didn't actually create. Yeah. But nobody else had put a patent on it. Right. And they do that to sort of cover themselves in case anybody gets competitive. But I think that in the last, I'll say 20 years, I think that's been a big influence on what you're seeing on the special editions and the high end of the major manufacturers now. They haven't gone as much away from ply shells because the ply shells are just so efficient and cost effective for them.
There's a thread that I'm finding across like institutions and business when you talk about, just with this story of like bigger manufacturers coming through and finding innovation in the folks that are doing it for the love.
Mm-hmm.
I was talking about this with David Johnson. I don't know if you know him,
Mm.
but he's been a recording engineer, producer, musician, session musician, all of it.
Mm-hmm.
He just moved to the area a few years ago. Really nice guy. He was talking about how the industry had changed and kind of the roles he was playing when he was producing popular music,
Mm-hmm.
especially in the early aughts, 2000s, when there were a lot of acts were coming through Orlando. He started getting frustrated. It was fun when he was producing things that were more of the ilk of like, there's pop singers that have talent,
Yeah.
that then he would produce.
Mm-hmm.
But when they started putting through a lot of folks that did not have talent, but they
Yeah.
were marketable in other
Right.
ways, that's when he started really having an issue with pop
Uh-huh.
music and stopped doing it eventually. And the same ways that, from my end, clinical medicine. So certain drugs are produced,
Mm-hmm.
certain studies are done. Some of our best findings have been found just because someone was interested
Yeah.
to answer certain questions.
Yeah.
And they came across a lot of answers by accident
Mm-hmm.
because of the process that they would go through.
Mm-hmm.
But then when you have so many institutionally funded, or from marketing companies and whoever else that say, well, we need a drug that does this, you start losing a lot of innovation. And there's something to following your interest and your passion through, and not always, and I know it sounds like a luxury to say, but not looking at the bottom line and not thinking about the budget can lead you to places that can be remarkable. And that's true of drum manufacture as it is of music production,
And
research.
sometimes it's a dead end. Sometimes you
Sure.
get to the end of that and you discover it doesn't mean anything.
Right.
I have one of the old Ghost Note guys, really good guy, and he wanted to see what he could do with the principle of the golden mean in drum design.
Yeah.
And
You're talking about like the golden ratio.
yeah, the golden ratio. Yeah,
Fibonacci
and he
sequence.
spent a lot of years
Yeah.
on that, and he kind of didn't really come up with anything.
Well, it's so funny.
Uh,
I've heard about some folks like creating a record
Uh-huh.
that is based on the Fibonacci sequence.
Uh-huh.
But they quickly also in this interview like suggested too the funny, like if the Fibonacci sequence is a thing, it doesn't matter if you're intentionally doing it or not. It happens anyway.
But yeah, so I believe that drums have personalities and individual characters and voices,
Right.
and I don't think anybody's going to convince me otherwise, because it takes the joy out of playing and building.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah. And again, it kind of comes back to like the drums, like so many people talk to about, ask them, how did you start drumming, or why did you do the drums? And really so many people will come back and say, well, they kind of found me, because it is a conversation every time you're engaging with this instrument. And it's, and some people don't like to talk in these terms because it feels loose and kind of what they would say, woo, or crunchy. And it's, at the end of the day, I mean, how can you take the spiritual element out of talking about art? I can't. So I feel like, so you don't have to talk about it, but honoring it, or at least accepting it to some degree, to me is like, it's kind of important. Because it's something beyond you. You don't really know. It's like we can try to study all the details of like why this person's ear and this person's taste is so different. We can go down those rabbit holes, and I think it's fascinating to me. And maybe there's something there, and maybe there's not. But we're probably not going to find the answer.
But it's that tiny sliver of knowledge that
Right.
you can,
But-
that can be a factor in
Right.
in deciding.
Exactly. And on that path, there's other things to be found.
Right.
And so, again, just following the interest, understanding, the drums have character, and it's a conversation every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good
Cool.
conversation.
Yeah. What would you recommend as far as maybe amateurs or folks that haven't been playing for very long, is a good way to kind of find the sound or experience the different sounds as they make the decisions to buy drums.
Don't look to spend a lot of money.
Uh-huh.
Get something used where the build quality is reasonable, and play with different tunings and explore. And yeah, you're right. At the outset, you don't know what you're going to want. So get something that you can mess around with for a couple of years. Find out what you like.
Yeah.
Find out what sounds you want to make.
Right.
That at the outset you don't know.
Right.
It's like a new driver should not own a Corvette.
Right.
First, they won't know enough to appreciate it, and second, it probably won't meet their needs.
Even the mass production instruments that are made, they still have some character, right?
Yeah.
Like you had mentioned, there's a personality, like that still exists, you know.
The difference between the math and I hear a lot of discussion about these outrageous prices on custom drums. Is it worth it?
Right.
Does it make a difference? Or even the high end of the mass-produced drums, is it worth that kind of money? And there's another subjective thing. It depends on who's asking and what their goals are. But the main difference between the mass production is that they're designing to a price point. The boutique shop, which is a word I like better than custom, the boutique shop is going to be, here are the goals, whatever it takes, in terms of time, in terms of cost of materials, in terms of standards.
Right.
It's a different situation than quality control. Quality control is let's not sell any errors. But in the boutique world, it's more like level of refinement. In that, it doesn't make sense for somebody at an entry point.
Sure.
They're not. If you don't hear the difference or feel the difference, don't spend the money on it.
Right.
To an extent, it's true even if you're not going to go to the custom end. If you just want to get a good kit,
right,
do some homework in playing a kit that might not be so good, but then you have an idea of what you need. I would rather do, and this is why I don't try to compete on price with the big companies. First of all, I will never get to that scale of cost effectiveness.
Sure.
I want to do it until I feel it's right. I kept saying I don't want to know how many hours I put into a drum,
right?
Because then I will know what I'm making, and I'll be really upset. And it's about the task at hand. It's not about the profit. It's not about the money.
Right.
So I would rather do fewer drums.
Sure.
Be able to price at something that covers my needs. It's not like socking away a nest egg, but it allows me to go over budget in order to get to the end result I want and not worry about it.
Well, thanks so much for coming over.
I had fun.
And having a conversation. Yeah, I did too. I learned a lot.
It's a good way to spend time.
Yeah, absolutely.
I get people who call me up and they say, I want to take a factory tour. And I say, well, the factory is about, it's a room about 20 by 20. And the tour lasts a minute and a half. But if you want to hang out, bang on some drums, talk drums, we can be there all day. This is always fun.
Yeah, absolutely.